Okay, welcome everybody. It's Jonathan Reams here with Augie Turak. How you doing there in North
I'm wearing my
Carolina?
specs, John.
Yeah, okay, so you can
John, I'm
see me.
wearing my specs. Yeah. I can see to Norway with this. This is like that Who song. I can see for miles and
That's
miles.
right. Yeah. So this evening, our goal is to take a little bit of time and reflect on some questions that we've seen come up in the forums, the different threads, some specific questions people have asked, some kind of more general questions. And our goal is to reflect somewhat succinctly on these. And so for people listening, our goal is not to try and answer everything exhaustively in depth, but to hope that as we answer each question, it ties into other questions that people have. And so hopefully the whole thing as a piece will give you a richer answer to each question.
That sounds great to me, John. I'm anxious to hear what your answers are going to be.
Well, I know I am curious to hear yours too, and we'll feed off of each other in this way. So the first question we had, we took and kind of boiled down to this notion of, can I trust the universe? Can I let go of control? Can I trust others to take care of my well-being and have my best interests at heart, or look after others? Can I let go of being general manager of the universe?
Right. I want to mention this. This comes from Michael Williams and Brian and Kendall and Kelly Castor on a string that they were working on. Give it
Yep,
some props there, John. Let's give some notoriety to people. This
that's
is
right.
15 minutes of fame, guys. Go ahead, John. How would you go about answering that?
Well, this is this kind of fundamental question of, do we feel safe in relation to the universe as a whole? And it's a question Einstein posed even. And how we answer that question, whether it's something we do consciously or unconsciously, colors how we answer all these other questions. So if we feel that trusting others is difficult, I mean, part of this is discernment. You don't want to trust somebody who's not trustworthy. But at the same time, if you see a person as see trustworthy qualities in them and give them that trust, then they have the invitation to respond in a way that meets your trust.
Absolutely. And I think that I mentioned a couple of times in a couple of different situations in Business Secrets of the Trappist Monks that whatever you want to see from other people, you have to be willing to offer first. So we've just been involved, for example, John, I was talking to you about, we've been involved in a really good stimulating conversation with Pete and me and Michael and Kelly about if you want to change somebody else, the first thing you do is ask them, how can I change? And the other thing that I would say succinctly about that is, the hero's journey takes guts. Some psychologist told me one time, I was talking about fear or whatever, and he said, the key is always, he said, when everything else fails, if you want to rule of thumb, turn in the direction of fear. Turn into the fear rather than away from the fear. This again goes back to what we're going to be later about a practice that you can. People are asking about practices. This is a practice. What currently is going on in my life that I'm afraid of? How can I turn into that fear and do the things that I'm afraid of? And yes, showing vulnerability, trusting somebody before you're sure that you can trust them. These are all you can do is you just lead there and lay it out there and have the courage to go first. It's where
Yeah.
faith comes in. I want you to talk a little bit about because John, you made some comments about why trust others when you can trust God. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that real quickly too.
Yeah, and I think this ties into something Kelly had asked in one of his replies here is, this thing that I'd made mention of, that when you're really on your path, it disappears in front of you. So how do you trust when you're no longer in control, when you really have to have faith and take that step? And of course, it's once you take that step is when the universe comes to meet you. But if you don't take it, the universe, there's nothing to play with. And so
Absolutely.
this is really about, do you trust that God, the universe, whatever you want to call it, has your best interest at heart and is using others and the material universe, other people, animals, whatever, to come and meet you. So, for instance, about a month ago or 6 weeks ago, my wife and I are here, and we live out in the country, and don't have a big social life or anything. And she works at home here, and suddenly a cat showed up, stray cat. Well, we checked with all the neighbors, nobody knew it, and so suddenly we had a cat, and it's been the most loving presence in our home. And it was just trusting that what we needed would show up when we needed it.
Absolutely. I mean, if you will get to that in the book, we'll get to that section where my whole life collapsed. The company looked like it was going out of business. Everything was going to hell in a handbasket. There was nothing, there was no light no matter which direction and I just kept putting one foot in front of the other. And the reason is, and this is coming back to your point, John, it's the aiming past the target. I think, and I almost would claim that, almost insist that what Michael was asking, is impossible if you don't have something bigger than your own self-interest at heart. If you don't have, for want of a better word, a spiritual base, a spiritual something you can fall back on, a philosophy, or not just a philosophy of your mind, but something deep in yourself that you're relying on, that it's going to carry, that you can have faith on when everything else is going to hell in a handbasket. And I think a lot of times people fail to work on that part of themselves until they suddenly need it. And then it's not there.
And then it's not there. You haven't exercised the muscle. Yeah. So, but I think a lot of the themes that we're going to look at coming forward in this call relate to this, and it's all around the notion of selflessness. And so in relation to that, Janice had a question about humility, because we hadn't really talked explicitly about humility. I think it's more implicit in there, but she had a question about it in relation to, does being humble mean basically being a doormat, not being in conflict with anybody, giving in. And if I'm disturbed about something, is it with me? And this is, I think,
am I the reason the problem?
Right. And I think there's, two things that come to me. One is, if we're disturbed, it's something in us. There's no doubt about that. And to be humble does not mean being a doormat. So my wife has this phrase recently that she came to. She says, I can give everybody unconditional love, but I can give them conditional access.
Absolutely. And I can't, when you mentioned, I mentioned that, I said it's like forgiveness, the same thing with forgiveness. Just because I completely and utterly forgive you for getting drunk and wrecking my car when you borrowed it from me, doesn't mean the next time you want to lend me you want my car, that I'm going to lend it to you. Forgiveness doesn't imply that I'm going to make the same decision over again. Just because you're disturbed doesn't mean there's something wrong. There are disturbing things in the world that need you to be disturbed about. And if you get disturbed about a child being bullied in front of you and you intervene and do something about it, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
So humility is a I just heard a really great quote I put on Facebook. I got to throw it in there right now, John. It said, there's two things that define you. When you have nothing, the patience you show when you have nothing, and the attitude you show when you have everything. And humility is the attitude that you show when you have everything.
Yeah.
And frankly, I think humility is a natural outgrowth of getting to know ourselves, because the more we know ourselves, the more we realize, we don't have all the answers.
No, and I had an experience when I was young where, we all carry a concept of what humility is with us. We have an idea, it looks like this or that or whatever, we're meek or mild, and I think these stereotypes can be there. But I had this experience of having my spiritual teacher walk by, and suddenly I realized, now I understand what humility is. I never had a clue before what it really was. But to have all of this capacity and power and might and be totally selfless in relation to it. And yet
I
that
agree
does,
with you. And I think another way of looking at that as well is it takes an enormously powerful person to show weakness.
yeah,
It takes a
yeah, it takes vulnerability.
humility. Exactly. And so the strongest people, the truly humble people, are oftentimes or almost always the strongest people. So
Yeah,
again, this goes back to your point. Being humble doesn't mean you have to be a doormat.
that's right. So then Kelly had a question, and it was, well, I actually had two questions. And one of them we said was kind of like this distinction between charism, a gift that you're given, and being selfless. If you're working on using your gift for the world, are you being selfish?
Right, right. And my answer to that very quickly is that in the beginning, in the introduction of my book, I said the key to making the Trappist magic work for you is sincerity, and then I added, or at least a sincere desire to be more sincere in your life, to become more sincere. We all start off like that, that child screaming, mine, mine, mine. We can't allow the fact that we're going to be cognizant of the fact that when we help the little old lady across the street, we're still wondering whether God's watching and patting us on the head as we do so. And then you realize that's egotistical and that's selfish. You have to work
Mm-hmm.
through this. This is part of the discipline. You continue to do it even though you're aware of the fact that it's being adulterated to a certain extent
Yeah.
with selfishness. And
Well,
so
and
you don't allow that to either A, depress you so much that you don't want to do it, which then becomes a game that kind of depression is actually selfish. Or
yeah,
B, just throwing up your hands and saying, well, I might as well just be selfish since I'm going to be selfish.
right.
I only have a selfish desire to be more selfless.
Well, and I think part of what Kelly's expressing too is a tension, almost a cognitive dissonance between what are basically limiting perceptions of what each of these things are. And so this is a case where letting that tension that you're feeling work on you, help you question your assumptions about what using your gifts means and what being selfless means. Because ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of like a Zen paradox, and they're not incompatible. But the reason they appear incompatible
Fantastic.
is that we have limiting assumptions of what those things truly mean. So
I couldn't agree with you more. And the last quick thing I'll say about that, John, is I said what I think happens is this is where the death and rebirth stage of the hero's journey comes in. You work and you work and you work and you work, and somewhere along the line, sometimes it happens in an epiphany, but usually it doesn't. It just happens. And I mentioned in chapter 2, I think, when I'm talking about Yext, where somewhere along the line, I became the kind of person who gets a bigger kick out of other people's success than I do out of my own success. Where did that revolution in consciousness take place? What day, what hour? I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
yeah.
But I worked and worked and worked at it, and suddenly one day, to me, I woke up and said, wait a second, I really get a kick out of other people's success.
And I think this goes to Kelly's other question, which is around recognizing that his current way of working in the world is kind of deconstructing and decomposing, and yet his clients feel his work's getting better. And so he said, but this is the thing, that when we let go of what we knew and what made us successful and enter into a bigger space, at first we don't know what it is we're doing. We don't have a name for it, a word for it. We can't, so we don't feel comfortable yet with it. But that doesn't mean we're not getting out of the way and being present for the other in better ways.
Exactly. He also, to quote Kelly, he said, as we embark on this journey, do you have any thoughts or suggestions how to keep going in our current worlds when we are in a state of challenging darn near everything we operate from and through?
Yeah.
And my answer to that's a great, great question. But my answer is that this is, again, where faith comes in. What do you fall back on where you're going to put one foot in when everything falls back? In my own case, when everything fell apart in our business, the only thing I could fall back on was my commitment to my friendship, to the people that were in my company, my partners. These were
Yeah.
my spiritual brothers. And I had to put one foot in front of the other and just keep going. And there's a great, in the Bhagavad Gita, this happens. In the very beginning, Arjuna, the battle is about to take place, and Arjuna he sees that his relatives are on the other side, friends and everything, and he sees he's going to have to kill people he loves, or they're going to kill him, and he falls on his face, and he's all despair, and Krishna comes by and says, "Get up, this doesn't, be a man. This doesn't." And I think there is a way to operate, if you work at it, there is a way to be simultaneously questioning everything and at the same time behaving as if you have the answers. You have the conviction,
Yeah.
and where I've always had the conviction is that I'm living the right kind of life. I might not have the answers to this situation, but this whole path that I'm on is the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that carries you through.
And I think this notion, what I remember from that passage in the Gita, probably the only passage I read there, but it left an impression, and that was that this relates to this theme that's coming up in some of these other questions about what does it mean to discover selflessness. Because part of what Krishna was saying to Arjuna is that the image you have of these friends and relatives, those are just temporal embodiments. They are not the true eternal self. So you're not killing that person. You're just doing battle in this world of, time and space and these things. So that leads us into another reflection that we had. So these are maybe not such direct questions, but one of them was around the fact that there were only a couple of responses to the 5-minute meditation activity. And one of the things that you and I discussed a little earlier was, well, why is this difficult? And part of that was that it's simply because people have, just like Arjuna did, this notion that the self is important. The self is what I'm identified with. And as soon as you take 5 minutes to be quiet, the self maybe starts to get a little nervous that, one, maybe it's not running the show, and two, maybe some of its weak points and things that you want to get rid of come into view and don't get hidden, and so it feels threatened. And so all sorts of things go into play to keep you from taking that 5 minutes.
I mean, it's absolutely almost funny or ironic, because in the book I talk about assigning this exact activity to 25 SKS students. And I believe Brian might have been one of them, but and they couldn't do it. And week after week after week, and then finally one kid said, "Oh my God, I can't understand. I asked him to sit in the chapel for 5 minutes every day at Duke. And he said, I walked. And the other kids said, yeah. And this one girl said, I don't know about you, but I know why I can't. And she said, and everybody looked at her and she said, I'm afraid that I'll sit there and realize that I'm wasting my life. And so these uncomfortable things, one of the big reasons why we have problems with meditation, contemplation, sitting quietly, anything, or even pure selfless kind of work, is that it brings up kinds of things that we don't want to look at, we don't want to see about ourselves.
Yeah.
The other thing, one of the things we're going to be coming to towards the end of our session today is practices. What kind of practices that people need? And one of the practices is anything you can think of that is going to teach you self-control. I'm sure everybody thought this was a good idea to sit for 5 minutes a day. I know I do, but then when it becomes a question of sitting for 5 minutes a day, it becomes hard. So the real work is not what happens, the content that happens when you're actually sitting for 5 minutes. It's the challenges around the whole activity that you have to learn how to control yourself, so you find that 5 minutes and you put your butt in the chair for that 5 minutes. And this applies to so many other areas of your life. So one of the great, I just posted something from my Zen teacher, John, on Facebook. He used to say, if you don't learn self-control, you will always live with shame.
Yeah. So the thing that I want to say a little bit here is to move us along is, for me, we often think, well, why should it? What's it going to give? Because the path disappears in front of me, and I don't know what the benefits are going to be. But I can say from the other end of this, I've spent 35 years now spending 15 to 20 minutes every morning. I just get up earlier than I need to every morning, and spend 15, 20 minutes like that. And I can say that most of the time, not a lot happens. But doing that every day for decades is the one thing that I attribute the success in my life to more than anything else.
Absolutely. And somehow, but it all started with your ability to say to yourself, tomorrow morning, I'm going to get up 20 minutes earlier and I'm going to do this. And then the second day you did it, and the third day, and little by little by little, it gets easier and easier. And that's self-control.
Yeah. So,
and we should work much more. We should worry much more on how we're going to develop self-control than what we're going to do with the practices that we don't have the self-control to do.
So, yep, we don't have too much time left here. So what are some other things we wanted to touch on here? We don't have too many more that we wanted to get into. We had...
well, there was the next one was that there was one response to the discussion of how do you define success. Real quick and dirty, the reason why I think there was only one response to that is that as soon as you say something out loud in a discussion about your definition of success, you are now accountable for that. And you have now set a goal, and now even if it's only in your own eyes, it's sitting there on the paper in front of you, and it's anxiety producing. Mm-hmm. And this is why you see this in business so often. Everybody loves ambivalence. We're going to try. Yeah, we'll see what we can do. We'll look into that. You hear all these kinds of phrases that are ambivalent and ambiguity because we don't want to be held accountable. So that's my answer for why people didn't
I
make
think
that.
That's good. Then we had a couple questions. When's the next course? When this course is over, then what? You got to love those ones, don't you?
Yeah, Jason said, I have a friend that I've given the book to, and she's reading it and has expressed interest in the course. She wants to know when the next course is going to be.
Yeah.
So John and I, and all we can say at this point in time is stay tuned, because Becky and me and John and Melissa have talked about we consider this a beta. This is our first one, so it has aspects at least of a beta. So that we're looking at how we're going to refine it, and how we're going to make it better, and then how to move forward. So thank you so much for asking that question. It's a very, very flattering question. Then the second question, John, is when this course is over, then what? And I would say that we're also looking deeply into that. There's all kinds of stuff. I have a farm down here. I've thought about getting enough people together. We want to keep a community going if we can. We've thought about having something, being able to have people sign up so that if there's a plan in place, then every once a quarter, John and I might sit down with everybody and say, how are you doing on your plan? We've talked about train the trainer, so that maybe people that are taking the course now would want to train the trainer and teach the course to other people. Yeah. Because my mantra is, again, you've got to have a community and a group. So there's a lot of stuff that we would like to continue this as a community ourselves. So again, stay tuned. We're thinking about it.
Yeah.
We're open to your ideas too.
Of course.
We want to hear their ideas about how they like to see it go on.
Yeah. So the things that we've been touching on that are some themes that came up in other things here is this notion of selflessness. And, one of the things that I've been working on writing about now in article is that, we have this impression that we are ourselves. And what we see, the reality is that this notion of a self is constructed from our mind, from the whole system of thought and feelings and physiology. So we have a sense of self. So the idea of selflessness is kind of equated with non-existence. How could we exist if we're not a self? But this is, to me, the key to selflessness is we actually most fully exist when the self is the least present and in the way. There's
Absolutely.
A quote from Tim Galway that I use sometimes. He did the inner game of tennis. And he says, what my insight was, when I'm teaching, the more I teach, the more my instructions are in the student's head, making them tense and nervous and doubting and self-critical. What happens if I teach less and less? And in fact, if I don't teach at all, how much learning can happen? And I think this notion of selflessness is not about non-existence. And a key thing that I've come across recently is this concept of the virtuality of self. So it's like a virtual game. some online world. We have an avatar or a character that we use and we play with and we inhabit and we feel. Like when we watch a movie, we get into and we feel the feelings of the protagonist in the movie and so on. In this case, we could view our lives in this way. We are like watching a movie. And if we can see that the self that we are living through is not the source of our being, then it allows us to have a little lighter hold and say it's not that the self is irrelevant. We use it to engage the world and function and so on, but it's not the ultimate beingness that inhabits us or that we are. So I think this notion of selflessness as the key theme in the book comes through in a number of these questions. And then the last question we really wanted to address is this notion of what are the kinds of practices that can help us gain this state of kind of non-attachment to the self, to allow this selflessness to come through. So what kind of ideas do you have around practices like that, Augie?
Well, the first thing is that we need to redefine terms. So much of my book and the discussion, John, you and I were having is to redefine. Most people think fear is a bad thing. We're telling you to turn into the fear. The fear is a good thing.
So
Most people think
practice
uncomfortableness is a bad thing. Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Turn into the fear. One of the things, you're talking about identification, so becoming less identified. But how do you do that? Now, let me tell you how you do that, and it's a little bit scary. And it's my concept. I think I bring it up in the book called disillusionment. Disillusionment. I called my Zen teacher in a book I wrote about him the great disillusioner. That's all he did. Now, if you think about it for a second, disillusionment has a very negative connotation. But if you break it down, it means to lose one's illusions. Does anybody really want to live an illusory life?
I had
We're terrified to.
Yeah, I had a student.
We're terrified to lose our illusions.
Oh, yeah. No, he came to me in one of his assignments in class, and he realized that actually disillusionment was what enlightenment came from.
Exactly. And you get, so it's a stripping, it's not a question of adding things, it's a question of stripping away BS, the mistaken views of yourself. Now, where the real scary part comes in, and this is a painful process, Gurdjieff said, and I know Jason, I think, is a big fan of Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff said, in the beginning, roses, roses, later thorns, thorns. In the beginning, it can be a very, very liberating feeling because, oh my God, you really mean I don't have to carry around that whatever, that guilt about what I did when I was 7 years old, so that goes away. But later on, things that's the fat. Now, later on, the muscle seems to be getting affected because really cherished ideas of herself end up becoming threatened. But deep down inside, our greatest fear is that if all of our illusions were stripped away, there would be nothing left. Right. What you call nothingness, that selflessness is really a synonym for nothingness. And it takes and the reason why so much of what great teachers, and I think what we're working on here, is it takes a very, very strong person to strip away all this stuff. So character building, becoming a very, very effective person is a very, very important part of it. But yes, I mean, this is,
so I think,
the way you do this is you put yourself in challenging situations. You may think it's like me asking that girl that one time, and I think community teachers are critical. Community teachers, everybody wants something they can do by themselves, sitting in a chair in front of a fireplace. No, you can't do it. It's a lifestyle, and it means other people. And so I talk the story about the girl in my group where I turned to her and I said, "What do you?" And I knew she kind of had a crush on me, and she was only 19 years old, and I was playing around with her, and I said, "What do you really think of me?" And I thought, "Oh, you're marvelous" or something. No, she turned around. She said, "You're extremely hard on yourself and other people." And it was devastating. I never forgotten. It was devastating. And it stripped away suddenly a whole lot of stuff that I thought about because what was also ringing in my ears was, my God, that's true. She's right. She's right. She's right. Is that it? Is that all I am? Yes, that's all you are at this point of your life, Well, it was very, very, very disillusioning, but tremendous growth up. I grew tremendously from that. I still owe that girl, her name is Sharon, by the way, tremendous debt of thanks.
Yeah. I think for me, just to wrap up, there's many types of practices, and and back to this sitting for 5 minutes or doing a spiritual proxy or anything, and all of these are simply to condition us to turn our attention to saying, what is the message life is bringing me? What is the light of humanity in others and situations, so that it's not interpreted as a threat, but it's interpreted as a gift from the universe? And what can I learn from this experience? How can I serve in some way? And if
It's
we simply,
intentionality, living in a.
yeah, if we can have that kind of practice and have it in a non-judgmental way, having an awareness that the universe is bringing us messages all the time, and if we can stop filtering those messages with judgments and attitudes and opinions of how things should be, then the universe can tell us, what do we need to do? What can we strip away, as you were saying, in terms of that disillusionment? And so we just maybe want to say, since this is our last video, just very much we've enjoyed immensely engaging and seeing the power of everybody else's engagement and how people have stepped up and shown up. We've really enjoyed being witness to that.
Absolutely. John and I talked for 10 minutes before we started this session today, just how impressed we've been with how incredibly. I wrote today on a thing that to a couple of guys. I said, hey, I had my concerns coming into this because I'd never done an online course before, that the intimacy, the authenticity, the courage that I've seen in interpersonal groups would not be able to be accomplished here. And I said, I am now a true believer. This works.
Good. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Augie. Bye-bye.